talk more about the court case now with criminal law expert Allis. Ian, a very good evening to you. Welcome back to News at Prime. Let's start with the issue of urgency, because Advocate Mpofu today said that basically what the president is seeking shouldn't be an urgent remedy, because if it was so pressing, he would have gone to court sooner. Did Ramaphosa blunder, I wonder, by granting those extensions to Zuma to indeed withdraw the private prosecution bid?
Good evening to Bakila and good evening to the viewers. Unfortunately for Mr. President, he did tie himself up into a little bit of a bind with regards to the issue of urgency. But because of the impending date being so soon, and the fact that he did give extension after extension, and he did act, and there was acts in good faith, the court will be lax not to go ahead and look and see that there was urgency. Also, when it comes with the extent of those indulgences that one could say that he granted to erstwhile President Zuma to withdraw the prosecution would also be taken into account from a timing factor. It's not as if this also started off 6 or 7 months ago. They'll look at what the essential trigger is, and that has been a lot more recent, especially with the service of the summons, and I believe there was a service of a second summons after the first one was stated to be defective in certain ways by the legal representatives. So I think President Ramaphosa will get away on the issue of urgency on this one, albeit a very tight call on that one.
Mm-hmm. We're also back to whether a nolli-prosecute certificate that does not have, let's say, your name on it explicitly is open to interpretation as to who can then be pursued using the same certificate. And Advocate Mpofu, in fact, says there's nothing wrong with those certificates.
I beg to differ with Advocate Mpofu, senior counsel, on this one. Is the reality that the charges were very specific in relation to Mr. Downer and Ms. Maughan in regards to the contravention and a breach of the National Prosecuting in terms of the Prosecuting Act and the leaking of information. The fact comes is that President Zuma relies on an after the aspect fact of him speaking to President Ramaphosa and saying for them to go to investigate. Now, the job of the president is not to become a police official within the realms of the NPA, and he is not empowered to go ahead and say what should be or shouldn't be quashed. So, unfortunately, it's a bit of a grasping of straws because it is a specific charge, and what he wants to try and charge President Ramaphosa with might be is clearly an overreach of the understanding. Yes, an accessory after the fact is if one is understood to have been involved and committed the crime. For example, if you have a murder and a conspirator, and that's where it is. To simplify facts, this is hardly the case of that when he said when Ramaphosa went and refused any further investigation on his own part or into the part of the ministry into the investigation and the criminal charge and the criminal charges of the nulla prosecution that was issued against Mr. Downer.
Am I right to say, though, Ian, that the issue of whether Ramaphosa's alleged failure to act when Advocate Downer allegedly leaked former President Zuma's medical records to Karen Maughan, the journalist, that issue will then be determined outside of this case, right?
Correct. It's a completely different charge, and it's a completely different form of a breach and of a criminal charge, whether it even extends to a criminal basis in its own right, may even be subject to interpretation.
I want to talk about the issue around inconvenience. The president's team, for instance, has mentioned that he's due to travel in the coming days to the World Economic Forum in Davos, and that is one of the reasons why he would not be able to be in the country on the 19th of January when the private prosecution issue is actually ventilated before a court. How do courts, how much consideration, how much of a weighting is given to issues around inconvenience when one is being pursued in this manner legally?
Let me put it in this way. It's also a big difference is what Zuma is trying to do is paint it that this is a personal pursuit of justice. And it has nothing to do with Ramaphosa's appointment as the president of the country. The fact is, he can't disregard that fact. And the balance of convenience is certainly going to favor President Ramaphosa and the tasks at hand of serving the better interests of the citizens of this country, as opposed to going ahead and serving the interests of whether or not Mr. Zuma has an axe to grind. The unfortunate aspect of this is where the issue of politics is being ventilated in a court with its own hidden agenda and reasons for it. The fact is that in one fell swoop, one argument is that this is against Ramaphosa personally, and in the other aspect, it's because he didn't exercise his duties as a president to assist in investigating the conduct of Mr. Dali. So realistically, one must take a look at the inconvenience as a whole and where it's actually coming from. It's not simply the aspect of just the travels, it's surrounding the facts and the merits at hand.
So who would have been a more suitable person then to pursue in this manner, or which office, in fact? Would it have been the head of the NPA? Would it have been the Justice Ministry?
Realistically, this should have then started, in all due respect, at the NPA's level. You can't expect the ministry to be investigating and acting as police officials. Remember, it first would have started off, and this is why it's very convenient that it seems to be poked at, that all fingers are pointing directly to Dana and Morn in this matter. Because in reality, who investigated it? Why was the Nolly prosecution actually issued? And if one could say that if he had a problem with that, maybe Mr. Zuma should have gone the alternative remedy is of a review prior to pursuing the private prosecution aspect and taking a look again and joining members of the head of the NPA, such as Shamila Batoy.
And on the issue of abuse of power, abuse of court processes, how long is that rope as far as what we each as people in this country were entitled to legal recourse? How far does it go before it becomes harassment or abuse, as has been said in this matter?
Unfortunately, it's a case-by-case matter. So, and I don't want it to sound like a cop-out, but in this situation, one must take a look at the conduct of the party involved, and not so much Mr. Ramaphosa, but rather that of Mr. Zuma in respect of dealing with the initial aspect which relates to the criminal charges with the French arms deal. That is where it initially stands and where it stems from, and what has been the actions resulting from that, and what has been the approach. That is where the determination of the abusive process. An abusive process doesn't simply come from a once-off aspect unless the matter is extremely frivolous and should never have even been considered as going to court. I would say the yardstick of abusive process, taking into account the conduct, was passed a long time ago in this situation.
Allis, criminal law expert, thank you for your time as always.